Welcome back to my channel, Famous and Fabulous. In the heyday of Hollywood, Westerns weren't merely motion pictures. They were a cultural power. Additionally, suppose each cowboy wanted someone to go with them. Gabby Hayes was the gold standard. He cycled with famous people, similar to Randolph Scott and Roy Rogers, imparting sardonic insight and the trademark's unforgettable one-liners, sour tone of speech. However, behind the beard and the giggles, Gabby shared tales that he never shared up to this point. For many years, admirers whispered about the actual events between Hayes and the renownedly quiet Scott Randolph. What caused them to appear on screen? Does the bond abruptly wane? Were there any others? More than just border behind the scenes camaraderie. Following decades of quiet, at last, Gabby Hayes revealed what everyone was taken by surprise when he confessed. In the heyday of Hollywood, Westerns took center stage and each cowboy required a faithful sidekick. One of the several Gabby Hayes stood as the one who performed that position out. Regarding traditional Western sidekicks, his name is always on the top at the very top, a mainstay of the genre's golden age. George was Gabby Hayes' birth parent. Hayes, Francis, May 7, 1885. He was the third child in a large family of 7, a family led by Clark and Elizabeth Hayes. Even though he frequently claimed to be from Wellsville, New York, in fact, he was born in Stannards, a little town nestled in the western region of the state that is close to Pennsylvania. His dad had a lot going on. He was the Hayes' manager. Additionally, he dipped his toes into the hotel oil industry, which was only beginning to boom in that area. George grew up in the company of his brothers and siblings, Clark, Morrison, William, and their sisters, Hattie and Nellie. Morrison, his brother, was a member of the U.S. Army and was sadly slain in World War I combat. George himself had a really typical little childhood in the town. He attended school in Stannards, and even in those early days was already displaying indications of having lofty goals. He played while still a high school student, baseball semi-pro, but he wasn't happy to remain stationary. When he was only 17, he packed his luggage and departed from home in pursuit of something more thrilling. He began with a stock corporation that travels, even spent some spending time with a circus, and finally settled into a vaudeville. On stage, he was a hit, particularly in comedic routines, where he would portray a foolish figure called the Rube Constable. The vaudeville, his career kept him occupied and prosperous 4 years. George wed Olive E. in 1914 Ireland, whose dad was a glassblower finalist. Olive did not simply remain on the sidelines. She also entered show business, performing with her spouse under Dorothy Earle, her stage name. Simply too, she wasn't the same, so please clarify. Dorothy Earle was a film worker, who both an actress and a writer. By 1928, George was doing fine when he wheeled around. Enough to take an early retirement, he and Olive bought a house in Baldwin, Long Island, believing they could at last calm down. Then came the Great Depression. Hit. And like a lot of people, George lost everything when the stock market crashed in 1929. Crash. Suddenly, their retirement plans had vanished. Olive arrived at that point, came up with a fresh concept. She asked George to try your hand at film acting. Thus, collectively, they gathered their belongings and made a jump toward Los Angeles in the West. When after relocating to Los Angeles, Hayes arrived. In Hollywood at the same time as the silent, the film era was coming to an end. He began by grasping little components, bit roles, background figures, everything he could obtain. At first, nothing significant. But then he had a fortunate encounter with a producer called T.M. Carr. Something pertaining to Hayes' Carr's attention was drawn to the look, and then, as you may recall, Carr had cast him in over the following 6 years, over 30 films. Early on, Hayes performed all types of people, including the antagonists. He would occasionally even appear as several characters in the same film. However, he truly discovered his calling in Westerns. Groove. It was during their heyday that the same was true of serial Westerns. Sidekicks and faces kept returning. Every movie. Hayes blended in perfectly. However, he wasn't an off-screen cowboy. In actuality, he never learned how to ride a horse up until his 40s. Off camera, Hayes didn't resemble he portrayed muttering, dusty characters. He was articulate, well-groomed, and carried himself in a refined manner. Amusing sufficient, he wasn't even fond of westerns. They seemed repetitious to him, which, fairly speaking, many of those B-movies were in a sense. However, viewers liked him in that sly, sarcastic role of sidekick. He gained notoriety for using expressions such as concet, dern panickety, dadgummit, yaden tootin, youthful female whippersnapper. From 1935 to 1939, he portrayed Wendy. The sardonic sidekick Halliday Hopalong Cassidy by William Boyd and rapidly became a well-known figure in the West. However, in 1939, following a wage-in disagreement with Paramount Pictures, Heder parted from the position. He didn't sit, but out for a long time. In the same year, he made a crucial decision to join Republic Images. There was only one problem. Wendy was still owned by Paramount Halliday. Republic so changed his name to Whitaker, Gabby. The same sour attitude, just a different name for the same adorable companion. This was his first appearance under the new banner, was Southwood Ho, traveling with Roy Rogers. That movie was the first of an illustrious run. From 1938 until Roy Rogers and Gabby Hayes teamed up in 1943, up for an incredible 41 flicks. A collaboration that continues to be one of the most common in Western cinema past. Their chemistry illuminated the screen. Gabby was more than just a joke. He was astute, wise, and frequently the one pointing to the right of the hero guidance. Although he switched names of characters in various films, the atmosphere remained constant. Grumpy but devoted with a talent for expressing precisely what have to be stated. Their collaboration began with stars from the underworld and changed into a machine that makes Western movies. Songs like Sunset and Red River Valley, The Man from Cheyenne Just Serenaded continued to arrive. The audiences were unable to sufficient. Roy was already becoming more popular, but he even gave Gabby credit for his assistance, develop as an actor. Roy brought the charisma and silent assurance. Gabby continued hue, coziness, and humor that provided those movies their magic. Indeed, there were other outstanding pairs of the time. Gene Smiley Burnett and Autry brought a Giving the Cowboy Recipe a musical spin, whereas Hopalong Cassidy by William Boyd has a sidekick crew that rotated, Gabby Hayes, among others, before his time alongside Rogers. However, none possessed the uniformity or appeal of the team Rogers-Hayes. They weren't merely the stars were consoling. Their films felt like reaching out to former acquaintances, particularly in difficult circumstances. They emphasized that goodness would always triumph, no matter how difficult the journey. Hayes played the majority of his career in the trustworthy sidekick, and in terms of, he shared the saddle with Western royalty, alongside a few of the greatest. He collaborated in 6 movies with Randolph Scott, includes one of their most notable partnerships, Badman's 1946 Territory. Badman's Territory. Now wasn't particularly trying to be subtle. This Western was a black and white bee that attempted to draw attention by throwing together all of the notorious screenwriters could locate. Belle Starr, Jesse James, the Sam Bass, Dalton, gang, you name it, they were present. Randolph Scott was a Texas sheriff who is straight on a endeavor to bring civilization to the untamed frontiers and incorporate them into the Oklahoma Territory. Tim Whelan, the director, enthusiastic but a little disorganized hand, the film sped from gunfights to political scheming with a lot of Western cliches in a short amount of time. The James Gang was the first characters in the story, stealing in the middle of the day from a train. Warm Sheriff Mark Rowley was on the trail of them, performed by Scott with his younger John, the deputy and brother, and another Mercer, a deputy. Let's get into the Crooked Bill Hampton, a U.S. Marshal, attempted taking the Posey in the wrong direction. Yet, they didn't believe it. They remained there, captured and apprehended. Lookout Kid, and Outlaw Hayes, of course, portrayed Coyote. The situation rapidly deteriorated. Mercer was killed by outlaw Hank McGee with a pistol, and John's attempt to guide Kid Coyote back Hampton attempted to kill them when he got to town. Both. Unexpectedly, Jesse James intervened to prevent him and took the injured John to the refuge for outlaws of Quinto. Hampton, meantime, twisted the narrative, portraying John as a participant in the James gang, which led to Sheriff Mark ride alone into the Badman's domain to clear the name of his brother. In the process, when Mark and Henriette met Alcott, a resolute journalist from England, Anne Richards filled the role. Romance blossomed. She joined the expedition, of course, to bring Quinto justice by organizing residents to become part of the new Oklahoma Territory. The movie cut in and out, square dances, outlaw gatherings, horse races, political appointments, final scene in which the villains turn thetables by assigning Hampton to oversee police and creating the Rowley, the Outlaw Brothers. In spite of the film's chaotic narrative made it a box office success. Hit, earning more over $500,000 in earnings. It even captured the Variety's attention, which commended it as enjoyable adult entertainment viewers. The producer was pushed by the success. Randolph Scott and Nat Hole will work together again for Trail Street in 1947. Another Western with authentic life figures, returning from silly sparkle to somber narratives. The Trail Ray Enright, the director of Street, after the renowned Bat Masterson, Randolph Scott's performance, as he stepped, prepared to enter the Kansas town of Liberalto, eradicate corruption, and safeguard farmers from a cattle baron who was hostile. It signaled a change in tone, combining a more responsible strategy with its typical B-Western taste. Gabby Hayes came back, raised to the position of deputy, and brought his distinctive humor to make the narrative with a lot of action. Robert Ryan, new off solidifying his antagonistic image, in Crossfire, a noble banker, was apprehended in a conflict on land. Anne Jeff performed an ambivalent dance hall girl with a gentle location for the antagonist. Steve Brody was Ryan's competitor for Meredith's fondness. The storyline veered through unlawful claims, land conflicts, charges, surprise attacks, and emotional strong entanglements with Masterson supporting the underdogs in an effort to order. The return of the bad men followed. In 1948, another initiative led by Enright from RKO. In the movie, Scott, Ryan, Brody, Hayes, and Jeff in a hybrid Old West's best hits lineup criminals. The idea is to round up each renowned villain, if they ever crossed paths, throw them at Randolph Scott, whether you want to or not, to observe the outcome. It ought to have been epic, but the movie fell short, off to the idea behind it. Robert Ryan performed in The Sundance Child with a flair for villainy, and Anne Jeff came back as Wild, Cheyenne. The niece of Bill Doolin, divided between allegiance as well as romance. Hayes in a surprising twist, this time portraying a bank presidential, around. The movie attempted to gunfights, politics, and romance into only one plot point. However, the character had little depth, and the triangle of love was settled with a whine rather than a bang. Even the expansive Oklahoman landscape. The finale didn't quite work out. Collectively. However, by the late 1940s, the western sun was beginning to set. Boom. The preferences were changing, and there was less demand than there formerly was. That's when Hayes mounted for a final ride, the Caribou Trail, in the 1950s. This wasn't a movie about a brawl in a dusty saloon. It was an experience on the frontier with a northern twist in the tough Canadian wilderness, rather than the typical tumbling western. American Weed Towns, the Randolph Scott, the show's star. Among Hollywood's steadiest hands, he was supported by an entire posy of well-known faces. Jim Davis, Dale Robertson, and Bill Gabby Hayes, of course, and Williams himself. The dependable Victor Jory portrayed the antagonist Frank Walsh, while Douglas Kennedy and other supporting actors, James Griffith, completed the team. Karen Booth added personality and a touch romantic tension as the proprietor of the saloon Frankency. The narrative now begins with Scott's persona, Jim Red Fern, wishing for better opportunities. He and his two friends, Williams's character Mike and Cattle, are being driven by Ling Li Tung Fu from British Columbia to Montana along the Caribou Trail's history. However, they struck trouble quickly. They attempt to pass a toll booth. Frank Walsh, the fraudulent bridge operator without having to pay money. Additionally, in exchange, their herd is stampeded by Walsh's thugs. Anarchy comes next. Mike loses his arm. The cattle are no longer there. Their lofty aspirations were dashed at for now at least. Ling, Jim, and their recent grizzly, my mountainman. Friend, that's try starting over Hayes by going to prospecting for gold. At the exact moment that it appears as though things might improve, they're taken prisoner by native fighters. They get away, but not together. Jim ultimately living in the forest by himself until he discovers a brook glistening with enough gold to start over. Soon, the crew gets back together. They connect with Grizzly's family members, Jane and Martha, plus Will, a no-nonsense foreman. They create a new cattle together. Endeavor with the goal of leading a new herd. Jim discovered a valley full of gold. But they haven't been forgotten by former foes. Walsh is hiding with his guys, prepared to make things challenging. Afterward, there's Frankency. She has a particular fondness for Walsh, also wants her, but Jim does. That affection triangle heightens the tension to the already difficult path that lies ahead. Perhaps the Caribou Trail did not aim for the Oscars, yet it produced a strong amusement. Only 81 minutes in, it includes enough showdowns, story twists, and livestock herds to appease any Western admirer. Production was managed by Nat Hole, with 20th Century Fox is looking after distribution. It's a little bit of a mixed bag. Certain scenes appear to be completely stunning, particularly the second unit footage taken in Colorado. However, the most California was the home state of the primary cast. Scenes from indoor sound stages are combined with actual outdoor video captured in locations such as Griffith Park in Los Angeles' Bronson Canyon. Since you hiked there, you'll undoubtedly identify the background. Here's a fun technical detail. The movie was first two-strip cinematography, but for decades, the most only seen it in white and black. That was altered when Kino Lorber brought it back to its natural hue. After working for more than a year, you can now, at last, observe the Caribou Trail. It was intended to be viewed, trails covered in dust and all the golden valleys. Following his run with the caribou on the big screen, Gabby Hayes done something that wasn't all cowboys did. He galloped directly into the living rooms of America. Yes, exactly. He make the switch to TV, kicking the Gabby Hayes Show is about to start. This was no ordinary Western, though. It began first in 1950 under a variously known as the Quaker Oats Show, since indeed our man Gabby was paired with breakfast oats in a dish. Image 8. 1950. Children gathered near the television, eyes widening when Gabby Hayes showed up on screen. Sitting in a regular shop in a Quaker Canyon is a small, dusty location. He would be spinning yarns and whittling away. It somehow kept returning to cereal. Additionally, in one memorable instance of in-TV history, Gabby would request that viewers remove yourself off the screen, then shoot a cereal-loaded cannon aimed directly at it. This was how they enjoyed playing off the Quaker Oats tagline, which was fired from firearms. Indeed, the show's name was changed to 1951's Gabby Hayes Show, but the charm remained constant. This live, the 30-minute program, wasn't only yahoe and slapstick. Every episode concentrated on historical occurrences. Horton Foote, as well as the scripts, were written by Jerome Coopermith, and they were captured in real time at NBC Studio 3A, within the Rockefeller Center. Everything on a modest spending plan of roughly each episode cost $5,500. However, in spite of the stringent purse reins, by 1950's end, people in 39 American cities were watching Gabby spin tales on TV regarding the expedition of Lewis and Clark, As a Boy, Buffalo Bill, the Battle of the Alamo, among other things. In December 1951, however, NBC debuted an all-new iteration of the Gabby Hayes Show, this time in a faster weekday format, 15 minutes. Initially, it broadcast 3 times a week, however shortly after started to occur every day at 5:15 p.m. The format, Gabby would share these amusing stories, fantastic tales of his wild imagination relatives, and between his tales, the sections from Classic B would be cut Taowesterns. Given how brief the program was, one movie would be stretched across an entire week, and right when you expected it was finished, Gabby would return with another tale that slaps the knees. Early on rising stars were featured on the show in 1952. Enjoy. Ross Martin's portrayal of Betty and Wyatt Hurtbell's star is Guard, but TV schedules are challenging, and on January 27, 1952, the Gabby Show's Sunday edition was cancelled. However, the weekday version continued to exist until January 1st, 1954. Gabby continued to talk on the phone even after that, not yet in his spurs. When Buffalo Bob Smith was forced to leave the Howdy to recuperate from a cardiac attack, Judy Shohu filled in for the attack? Nobody else but Gabby by himself. Additionally, in Authentic Cowboy, Gabby was more than simply a TV anchor. She owned fashion. He operated a boys' summer ranch camp and appropriately, girls in East JW, New York, called the Ranch of Gabby Hayes. However, Gabby's legacy extended beyond the screen. From between the late 1940s and the 1950s, Charlton Fawcett also released an entire comic book series that bears his name. Additionally, even after having given up watching television, he maintained appearing occasionally, particularly on Howdy Duty, seeing his former friend, Buffalo Bob. Currently, behind the bushy beard and those sour tirades on TV was a husband who was devoted to his wife. After 43 years of marriage, she was everything to him. As directors may have provided him with notes on his performance, his wife's alone viewpoint that was actually important. Unfortunately, shed on July 5, 1957, but Gabby was left in complete despair. They never had children, thus the loss washed it even more forcefully. Following her passing, Hell lived at his Tuca Lake residence for a while, California ranch, then relocating to he owned a little apartment complex. As the years passed, Gabby's condition began to deteriorate. Early in 1969, he was brought to St. Joseph Medical Center in Burbank, will have heart treatment. Illness. The following week in February, he died on September 9, 1969, at the age of 83. He was buried in Forest Lawn. Hollywood Hills Cemetery. I appreciate you observing.